Welcome back, glad you're here. In this video, we're gonna be building box beams. I'm gonna show you some really good techniques to build box beams to get extremely high quality results with zero exposed fasteners. I'm also gonna share my process on how to build these extremely efficiently so you can make them quickly and maximize your profits. Now, some of you guys may not realize this, but I actually use these videos to teach my own employees and subcontractors that I use so that I don't have to explain myself over and over again for years to come. So in this video, I'm gonna be walking you through this whole process as if you were one of my employees. I'm gonna try and teach you all the tips and tricks, all the small things you need to know to do this effectively. Now, right away, one of the first areas where we can maximize efficiency is getting our material to the shop. Unfortunately, I expected this to be delivered to my shop and it went to the job site, so we had to load this all on the van. But I got the van backed up right here, right behind the table saw, so we should be able to pull this off efficiently for making these beams and getting it started running it through the table saw. The first thing we're gonna go through here is the process on getting our table saw set up for ripping a bunch of white oak material. Blade choice is extremely important. If you choose the wrong type of blade, it's gonna make you have to work a lot harder. It's gonna be harder on the blade. You're gonna have to push through a lot harder. Your joint won't be as high a quality sometimes. If you choose the right blade, your material is gonna go through much more effortlessly. You're gonna get a better glue joint, so on and so forth. So what I've got here set up is a Ridge Carbide glue line rip blade. It's a 30-tooth blade, so it's fairly aggressive, but it's still gonna give me a really nice, smooth glue line rip joint. A lot of times in the shop, I will keep a 40-tooth blade in the table saw because I'm bouncing back and forth between cutting plywood and ripping one-by material so often. But whenever I'm doing a specific task like this where I've got a ton of ripping, you wanna stop, pick the correct blade for what you're trying to do, and it's gonna go a lot better. So we've got 30-tooth glue line rip blade, Ridge Carbide in here. I've been loving this blade, by the way, it's excellent. Let's move on to the next step. We will be getting our power feeder set up on the table saw. But with the power feeder, we're not gonna be able to use the riving knife or dust extractor. So we're gonna go ahead and pull my throat plate off here and just remove this whole riving knife and dust shroud. That way it's out of the way. And we'll set our blade angle first before we get our power feeder set up. I built this handy table saw cabinet, and this is where I keep all of my most commonly used table saw accessories. We've got some blades over here, dado plate, dado stack, stuff like that. But then different things over here, depth gauges, caliper, you know, all that good stuff. So here's my angle finder. We'll go ahead and get our blade angle set. I'm gonna turn that on, and I want to make sure that it is zeroed first. So as you can see there, I've got 0.0. If say it was reading something slightly off, so right now, let's see, well, that's 0 degrees too. If it's not, you can re-zero it just by hitting the 0 button here. So let's say I've got this at this angle, and I hit 0. Now it's actually zeroed the way I was holding it, which we obviously don't want. So I'm gonna set it on the cast surface here. I'm gonna hit the 0, so now it's zeroed again. Notice that the magnets I have facing towards the blade. That way I can slide this over. Now it's on the blade. We're reading 0.0, which is good. And now we can tilt this to where I want it. Note that when you do this, you really want to raise your blade all the way up. That way the magnet attaches nicely to it. If you have it down further and the base was touching further up here on the blade, it could actually be slightly off. So always raise that up all the way whenever you start this process. So now what angle do we want to be shooting for? Right there, we got about 45.6. That's a bit much for my taste. I like to be at about 45.3 to 45.5 for something like this. So that's pretty ideal right there. I made up these beam samples earlier to help show you what we're kind of shooting for here. And you'll notice if you look at these miters, they're actually pretty tight the whole way through. Whenever we do our rip, if we go up to say 46 degrees on our rip, the heel of the miter will be more open, so you'll have a lot of glue in there, or if you don't glue it enough, you just flat out won't have any contact. So we want to find that happy medium where we've got a good glue joint, but the most important thing is we want this miter on the outside corner or on the toe of the miter to come together extremely tightly so that it's seamless. That's why we overcut past 45 degrees. If you cut right at 45 degrees, if your material is perfect, it'll go together decently well. But if any of your boards are cupped or you have any twisting in the boards, you may end up with an open miter. So by cutting past 45 degrees, we give ourselves a little bit of margin for error to where that very outside tip of the miter will come together nice and tight. And then it gives a little bit of room on the back side here or the heel side of the miter for that glue to go and just gives us margin for error. You will notice here, these miters were cut at 45.3 degrees. We've got ever so slightly a little bit of openness on the back side here, but for the most part, it's very, very tight. And that's gonna give us a nice strong glue joint. If we would have went past 45.5 degrees, you would see more openness back here on the back of the miter. So as a general rule, the flatter and straighter your material, the closer you can go to 45 degrees. The more cupped, twisted, and longer, inconsistent your material, you may want to go 45.5 or even higher in some cases if your material is really bad. Typically, if I'm like miter folding a mantle out of plywood where I have extremely flat material that's easy to work with, you can get closer and closer to that 45 degree mark where you're at, you know, that 45.3 degrees. But on these beams, the material is pretty good, so I'm gonna go 45.3 and I'm gonna have a real nice glue joint here. Now that we've got our miter set, we can go ahead and lower the blade and we can bring our power feeder over here and install that. Actually, before we go any further, I want to show you a big mistake that you could potentially make you want to watch out for. So whenever you're doing your angle finder here, I've got it zeroed, it's flat on the table. I'm going to push it over and connect it to the saw, and I'm making sure that it's firmly pressed down and it's nice and square to the saw. Now I'm going to tilt it over. It's very important to notice I did not touch the angle finder or the blade the entire time as I was tilting it over. But watch what happens if you move this. So now my angle is 45.6. So if you move this, it's going to really mess up your angle and it's no longer going to be accurate. So you have to make sure that as you're dialing in this angle, you don't allow the blade to move or allow your angle finder to move. Okay, so now it's time to set up the power feeder. You'll notice it's just resting on this trash can right here. That's because this trash can just happens to be at the almost exact same height as the table saw. So that's how I've actually been storing this and moving it around because it's extremely heavy. I did this for a long time without a power feeder. If you don't have a power feeder, an awesome tool to have for a table saw like this are these Jessum clear cut stock guides. I've showed these before. They help keep the material pressed down and pulled in to the fence. Won't be needing those today, but they're a great option if you don't have a power feeder. Getting this power feeder into position, I can't emphasize enough how careful I try to be doing this because this power feeder weighs at least 100 pounds, if not 150 pounds. And it's huge, awkward, cast iron, tons of sharp edges. Basically, if it falls and lands on your foot or your leg, I mean, you could literally lose a foot because it's gonna absolutely destroy you. It's gonna crush you. So be very careful. I do in the future, I want to build a cart so that I can move this around a little bit easier, but this is just how I've been doing it. So I just get it right up beside here. As you can see, I got one corner kind of positioned on there, and then it's just a matter of just being really careful and pushing it up into place here. So we're pretty much safely on there now, and I can kind of start just wiggling it around over here where I want it. One thing about these mag switch magnets on this base, I've found they stick a lot better if there's no sawdust on the underside of the magnets or the table saw table here. So give that a good wipe off, blow it off. If you set it down on top of much sawdust or wood chips, it's not gonna stick nearly as well, and it'll twist whenever you have material running through, and that's no bueno. We don't want that. All right, looking at setting this up, first thing, I'll get this cord out of the way. And I always position the magnets all the way as far over as I can here on the corner of the table saw top right here. So then all you have to do is give these levers a twist. That engages the magnets, and it's gonna start sucking down here. So there it's sucked all the way down, all 4 magnets. We can raise this up now and swing it over the top of the blade. I do find getting this set up for me is usually pretty quick, because basically the only thing I use this for is ripping on the table saw. So it's really usually just a matter of putting it back on, connecting the magnets, and then everything is basically usually set where it should be. Now let's take a look at our height here. It should all be level because I was just using this the other day. But one of the easiest ways to check and see if your rollers are in line level with the table is just to lower it all the way until they're basically just touching the table, and then you can see if it's tilted one way or another, and you can adjust that. As you can see here, I'm nice and level, so I don't need to do anything with that. Basically, the next step for me is I want to take a piece of the material that I'm going to be milling and set my height based off of that. So I'm going to go ahead and raise this back up now, and I pretty much want the top of my material to be about 1/8 of an inch higher than the very bottom of the roller. If you go much more than that, it creates so much tension trying to push the piece through that this whole thing will want to move. And even though these magnets are extremely strong, it's not bolted down. And if you put that much tension on it, it will push back and move on you. So you want to find that nice medium where you've got just enough tension to feed the material through well, but not too much. I find that having the top of the material about 1/8 inch higher than the bottom of the wheels is perfect. You will also notice here, this is a 4-roller power feeder, and this wheel is removed. I do that way if I'm ripping narrower material, I can have my wheels straddle the blade without cutting into the wheels by having this wheel removed. Next, I'll want to just get my fence set up about where I'm going to be ripping. So I've got a bunch of 1x6 that I'm going to be making beams out of. They're going to be 6x6 beams, which will basically be 5x5 beams when I'm done. So I can move my fence over here to 5.5. I know with the bevel, I need to reduce that by 3/4 of an inch. So I'll move it over to 4 3/4. That tells me about where my fence is at. And as you can see here, my feeder is pretty well where I need it to be. If I needed to go further that way, I could loosen this lever and crank it in to move the whole thing that way. If I needed it to go further out, I could do the opposite. The next adjustment we need to make is the cant on the wheels on how they feed the material into the fence. So obviously we would not want it angled like this. It would create a bunch of stress and friction on the wheels. It would make the wheels actually skip as they're trying to pull the material through. It's just no bueno. We do, however, want it to be slightly canted in towards the fence so that it's pulling material ever so slightly in towards the fence. If I would have it so that the wheels were actually going that way, the material would go through and it would pull the material away from the fence, and we'd have a disaster. That wouldn't be good. So we want it to be canted slightly in towards the fence, about 1/4 inch to 3/8 between the front wheel and the back wheel, I think is pretty ideal. And that'll work well. As I mentioned before, there's a huge amount of pressure that this 1 horsepower feeder creates as it's pulling the materials through. So it's extremely important that before you start up your operations, that you go through and double check every single lever to make sure it's locked down. What you don't want to do is grab a board, start to feed it through, and realize that you forgot to lock down one of these levers, because all of a sudden the whole thing will take off on you and potentially pull your wheels right through the blade, and that would not be good. You also will notice I am tightening them pretty good. I have found that if I don't tighten them real well, it can still move a little bit, and we don't want that. One shop improvement that I made recently was to add power down here for the power feeder. Previously, I got a cord reel over there. I was pulling a cord over here all the time, but I actually ran an extension cord all the way around here up to my ceiling, and I just tapped into my overhead garage door opener outlet right there to run my power feeder, and it's been really nice just to be able to connect it right there now. This particular feeder has multiple speeds which can be adjusted here. I keep it on the slower speed for this operation, and then the wheels also go both directions. So whenever you actually turn it on, you need to look over here and verify that the wheels are going the correct direction. So we'll turn that on. You can see here the wheels are feeding in the correct direction. So we're actually good to go now. The only remaining thing I need to do is verify my blade height. As you can see, I put that down low while I was setting this up. I'm gonna set it about 1 inch, maybe a little over 1 inch high for ripping this 1x material. That should be about right. Before we get started milling, I want to verify that the blast gates on the other areas of the shop are closed. That way I can get maximum suction down here at the table saw. Also, I like to go up and kind of bang off my filter and even blow some air into it so that I'm getting maximum suction up there before I start doing anything. If you let it go for too long, you just lose a lot of suction. When I'm working in the shop, I almost always have this set up right here. It's just got my tape measure and pencil, goes right into your belt loop here, and then my dust extractor remote is right here. I got it so that it clips on, and then it's on one of those retractable keychain deals, so we can turn it on like that. I don't really know why, but you do have to come over here and get pretty close to it with the remote. I've heard that the LED lights can actually interfere with the signal, but for some reason, if I'm over at the table saw, it'll shut off from over there, but to turn it on, I usually have to get fairly close. The other thing you'll notice is that whenever you bang off the filter and blow it out, you can hear the difference in suction in the extractor after you do that. A lot of times, even after you do that and you turn it on, you'll hear it all of a sudden like pull a bunch of extra wood chips down the chute because it's just got a lot more airflow all of a sudden. So green button, here we go. That sounds really good. Got some good suction, ready to start milling. I should add also, you always want to keep an eye on these tubes, because once these suckers fill up, you don't want to be backfilling the extractor all the way up there. Could be a really bad deal. So I'm always keeping an eye on these things to make sure that I'm dumping the barrels whenever they need it. Okay, time to let her rip. Start pulling material off the van, run it through, and then some of the pieces I'll stack on that table back there. The ones that get a bevel on both sides, I'll stack back here on the side of the table saw right here. Okay, getting a good start here. Getting them stacked up, still a long way to go. A couple things definitely worth noting. So whenever you've got your power feeder going, it does make a lot of sawdust, and that sawdust gets on your wheels and that causes them not to grip as well and eventually start slipping. So for me, I always keep an air hose kind of hooked on up here, and about every 2 or 3 boards, as it's feeding through, I just blow some air on there, and that gets a lot of that sawdust off of those wheels, and it'll make it grip better. But I've found it's necessary to keep those wheels clean. It would actually be awesome to have a little air fitting over each of these wheels that you could just hook up and blow air down. I don't know if it would just make a dusty mess or not, but anyways, that's something you pretty much have to do. The other thing is, while we're sorting material here, as you pull material off, there's basically 2 things you need to do. First thing is you need to figure out which side is the good side. So pick the better side. With white oak, a lot of times you'll have a little bit of this more sapwood, whiter color. So I'm looking for that. If I see that one side has more or less of the sapwood, I'll pick the better side. So this side has less, so I like this side better. The other thing I'm doing is I'm looking for the crown and the board. These are gonna be beams. They're gonna be cathedral beams. So when I run these through and I fit these to the ceiling, I wanna start with the crown down. That way, as I put these up to the ceiling, I'm making contact at the bottom and top of the board. I don't want the crown up in the middle, because then that beam would rock on the ceiling. So I'm selecting the better side, and then I'm figuring out which side has the crown. And if it's crown down, I'm ripping the bevel on that side with the crown down. The other thing we'll do with sorting these boards is we'll rip the bevel on all the boards on one side first, but then we'll select the boards that will be the bottom of the beam, and those I want to select that have the best face in terms of wood grain, no knots, no color variation, but then also the straightest boards I'll typically use for the bottom. You don't want to use a board that's got a big crown in it, because then the whole beam's going to be curved. So after we get all these ripped one side, we'll sort out our best ones as far as the grain and as far as being straight, and then those we'll select as our bottom boards to rip the other bevel on the other side as well. Something else that is noteworthy, how do we know how wide to start off ripping the sides? Basically, you know, we're paying for a 1x6, so usually I want to maximize the full depth of the 1x6 for the sides of the beams. Now the bottom portion is a different story. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But essentially what we want to do is just be ripping the bevel just enough that we're always getting a completely sharp edge. So essentially I'm going to set up my saw so I'm taking a 1/16 off of this at the outside of the board, and you'll see I'm actually ending up right around 5.5, just about a 32nd under. And what that's currently looking like over here at the table saw, if I can just basically do the math in my head, I know I've got a 5.5 inch wide board. I need to take 3/4 off of that, and that would essentially get me to the outside. And then I'm going to take an additional 1/16. So I'm basically at 4 11/16 set up right here to ensure that I'm ripping all the way through and getting a nice sharp edge on those boards. At this point, I've got everything cut. So over here are all of the sides for our beams. We've got 2 different sizes of beams. And then I sorted through the entire stack and picked the best boards that had the best face, and then were also the straightest to use as the bottom board of our beams. So then on all of these I've got set in here, we'll rip our bevel on the other side. Before we rip our bottom board to size, there's something very important to understand, and that starts with the question of exactly how wide should we be ripping that board. Now to me, how wide I rip that board is based off of the blocking that I want to use. For me, we have this wonderful finger jointed poplar material. It's reasonably priced. It comes nice and straight. It's consistent. I would much rather use a material like this for my interior blocking to attach the beam to the ceiling versus traditional framing lumber. Traditional framing lumber has a lot of variation in it and inconsistency, and it's a lot more difficult to work with and just more difficult to get straighter boards in general. So when I use my blocking on the ceiling, I typically just use poplar 1x material. Now, as you know, a 1x4 nets to 3.5 inches wide. A 1x6 nets to 5.5 inches wide. So I'm basing how wide to make my beam off of how wide my blocking is going to be. It just saves some time and steps by not having to actually rip down my blocking to a specific width. It's also less wasteful. So these are some common beam sizes. Right here, you would see this is an 8x8 beam, and this nets out to just a little over 7 inches wide. That also allows me to use a 1x6 up top here for my blocking. So I'm only losing about 1/4 inch, actually less than 1/4 inch of material down here because a 1x8 nets out to a nominal 7.25 inches. So we're only ripping about 3/16 off of a 1x8 for this bottom board. So it works out really well to use a 1x6 for blocking. Here we have a 6x6 beam. Here we would be using 1x6s all the way around, and this one is going to net out to a little over 5 inches. This is about 5 1/16 strong, and that will allow me to use a 1x4 up top here for blocking, so I can just take that 1x4 right from the material rack, fasten it to the ceiling, and attach my beams to that. I don't have to rip anything down. If I said, oh, I want to maximize the 1x6 and not rip any more material off of it than I have to, and I want to get 5 3/8 out of that, well then with my blocking up here, I would be having to take a 1x6 and I would essentially be ripping 2 inches off of it, which would be pretty wasteful. Not a great use of time or material to do that. So that's how I'm basing my beam sizes here. Got 1x8 here, box beam using a 1x6 blocking, 6x6 uses a 1x4, and then here we have what would be a 3-inch wide beam. It's just using an 1.5 inch piece, which I did rip down for that. So that's how I determine what this bottom board is. Now, one more extremely important thing. So you might say, okay, great, I will make my 6x6 beam exactly 5 inches wide. That way I can use 3.5 inch blocking. You don't want to do that because nothing is perfect. And then whenever you go to fit your beam on the ceiling, if there's no slack or give at all, it's going to be extremely difficult to push that beam up over this blocking piece. So as you'll notice here, this goes in pretty easily, and that's because I oversized the bottom by about 1/16 of an inch. I find that that's about right so that when I'm installing these beams on the ceiling, they'll still slide over the blocking, but it's not too difficult. If you make your beam too narrow to where it's tightly fitting over this blocking, it can be a real wrestling match to get it in place, especially with the longer, heavier beams. So that's my thought process. You want to oversize your width on the bottom by about 1/16 of an inch to give you a little bit of play to go over your blocking. The other thing is, right now it's August, and a 1x6 is going to be 5.5 inches strong. It's going to be an extra 32nd wider than 5.5 inches just because of the humidity this time of year and whatnot. So you got to keep that in mind. Make sure you make it wide enough. All right, guys, well, that was a whole lot of ripping, but we're done here. So this is enough material for 18 beams right here. It's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so I am definitely not going to be getting these done today. Even tomorrow, 18 beams at a ½ hour a piece for assembly is going to take all day long. But we got a really nice setup here. Very good quality miters on the ends of these. They should go together really well. At this point, got a massive mess, tons of table saw offcuts that I need to take care of. I'm gonna try and get this place cleaned up a little bit, get the trash out in the dumpster before I start putting these together. So I found whenever you've got a big pile of offcuts like this, obviously I can't get 12-foot sticks into my dumpster. Cutting them into shorter lengths works best, and it's best just to, right on the ground, grab a circular saw, suck it up, and just cut them really quickly versus trying to carry them over to the miter saw. Just takes a lot longer and there's a lot more footsteps. So that's in the dumpster. Next problem I have over here is usually I get started working and I don't like to stop. And for whatever reason, this drum fills up faster than this one, just with the airflow or whatever. So you can see on this tube here, this is full, but this one's not. So now I gotta dump these suckers too. So usually what I end up doing, partly because I let it get too full and partly just to reduce the weight and make it easier on myself, is I'll just take a dustpan and I'll offload this into a trash can just to get this stuff cleared out of the chute so that the bin's not overflowing, but then also just to reduce the weight so it's easier for me to lift it into the dumpster. You really need a dust mask for this, it's terrible. Dust mask engaged. So then I keep this hand truck over here just so that I can easily get these out to the dumpster, and kind of the same thing. I may just scoop some of it into the dumpster just because the drum itself is steel and it's really heavy, and then when you add the weight of this super fine white oak sawdust, this is extremely dense sawdust. It's not like planer sawdust, so it's really heavy. And I don't try not to hurt myself too much, but lifting a 55-gallon drum of this stuff is not easy. So that's why I like the small pieces, cut them up. They fit in the dumpster better. Got a bunch of sawdust in there. Got all of my trash taken out, swept up, blown out. So shop is actually looking pretty clean and set up pretty well for a good productive day of monotonous beam making tomorrow. So check back in the morning. All right guys, so picking up where I left off, it's about 24 hours later now, evening, next day. I've assembled almost all the beams. I've got 2 more beams to go, got a few over here, and then if we come over here to the back of the van, you'll see these other basically 3x8 beams all assembled here. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the interior blocking on these beams, how to do that. As you can see on these beams, these are being miter folded with strapping tape. Strapping tape is about every 14 to 16 inches probably, and it works extremely well. It allows you to assemble these beams and not have any exposed fasteners on the corners. And it's also very fast and productive, gives great results. It's definitely the way to go. So how do we go about this process? You'll notice we've got blocking on the inside of these beams as well. To start off the process, we just bring our boards over here and we basically lay them face up to begin taping. So here I've got my center board, both miters, and then the other boards on the sides. The trick with this is that as you tape across here, you want the very tip of this miter to be just touching perfectly. If it's just perfectly in line and you tape across that, whenever you fold it over, everything will come into alignment perfectly. Now sometimes these boards do have a bit of a crown in them, so you kind of have to work from one end to the other to keep things aligned as best you can. I've talked about this many times in other videos. If I'm doing like a plywood mantle miter fold, I like the regular packing tape Duck brand HD packing tape. But whenever I'm doing long boards like this, I like strapping tape. It's got the little fibers in the tape. It's generally quite a bit stickier than the regular strapping tape, and it's got a little bit of elasticity to it, so it'll stretch a little bit as you fold that miter. I find that it works really well. I've purchased about a gazillion of these tape dispensers. They are absolutely fantastic. I'll link them in the video notes, but this is what you want for applying tape on something like this. It's very easy to pull the tape out and then cut it off really precisely. Another very important trick, eventually you're gonna have to pull all this tape off, and you wanna be able to just grab it and pull it off, not have to sit there with your fingernail trying to pry it off. So before you apply the tape, give it a little fold over. That way later on when you go to pull it off, you can just grab this tab and rip it right off. You can't really see what I'm doing, but I am trying to carefully get these miters to just be touching as I run the tape across the face. And again, these boards aren't perfectly straight, so sometimes I'll have to pull it apart a little bit and adjust it. That way it's where it needs. Now you will notice with this board, we do have a little bit of wonkiness. The boards aren't perfectly flat either. Sometimes that makes them not want to fold up really well. This is one of those things where practice makes perfect. Once you do it for a while, you'll get a lot better at it. But I like to pull it over the edge, and as you can see here, it's not wanting to fold over. That's because down here, I've got a curve in this board, so I need to give it a little pull so that that miter aligns, and then it'll fold down into place. You don't want to force it too much if it's not in alignment, because you could crack off the end of that miter. So just carefully, see here, this one's folding up nice, and then we're just going to roll it over like so, lay it flat. Now we can glue our miter and install our blocking. So let's talk about our blocking that we're going to need on the inside of the beam. Why is it important? Because if you just miter folded the beam without anything to keep it square, it would tend to want to toe in, and you would not have a consistent space across the top here, which you want to be able to easily get your blocking inserted whenever you try to fit this beam over your blocking. So having blocking squares it up, number one, and number two, it's going to give you the proper space and width so that your sides don't come in too far or stay out too far. It's just going to make it all nice and square. Sizing the blocking. So if you remember, we oversized our beams slightly so that we could use nominal 1x4, 1x6, etc. blocking. So these beams right here are actually measuring about 5 1/8 across the bottom. If I used 1x4 blocking, it would actually be too small. It would end up toeing in because I oversized the beams. So you have to make your blocking width a little bit larger to match this inside dimension. So these blocks are actually about 3 9/16. They're a little bit oversized. Could have even made these a little bit bigger probably, because I'm actually finding that as I'm fitting this 1x4 across the top, some spots it's great, other spots it's a little bit tight. So I actually probably could have went a hair more. But anyways, that's the goal. Now, how high should your blocking come up? You'll notice here on this beam, to the top of my blocking, I'm 1.5 inches down from this top edge. That's very important because we need to have sufficient space for our blocking here. You can see how tight it is here on the end. But then I also need space to scribe off the top whenever I fit this to the ceiling. So giving myself 3/4 inch of leeway to scribe off is probably plenty for these 12-foot long beams. So that's kind of the theory and practice on what we're trying to do here with the blocking. There's a reason for everything that I do. almost all the time because it makes life easier down the road. So I'm trying to explain that because whenever you're up under a hot cathedral ceiling, sweating, trying to push up a big beam into place by yourself, you're gonna be thankful that you did this correctly whenever you built the beams. Gluing up is pretty straightforward. I'm pretty sure a glue bot is pretty much the best invention of this century. But getting just the right amount of glue is key. These will go a lot faster building them if you don't over glue it. So you notice I'm gonna do both sides. I like a squiggly line on there. My theory is it kind of helps spread it across the whole miter. And then you'll see in a second what we're gonna do to spread the glue. You can see how fast this goes. It really doesn't take very long to get glue on here. So I fold it up into place because it kind of smashes all that glue and kind of pre-smears it. But then it's just kind of an art to take your finger, spread it to get good even coverage. And again, having just the right amount of glue is key. It makes it go fast later in a couple minutes whenever we fold it up because we won't have as much glue to clean up. Next, we will add our blocking. Where did my drill go? There it is. So, got pocket hole screws on these. I just used scrap material to make the blocking, just some scrap plywood that I cut up. To get this centered, all you gotta do is just squeeze the beam together and it'll kind of self-center. And then what we do is just take same strapping tape, fold it over, and pull it over this side now to just help keep that beam squeezed together. So here's another little trick. Essentially, because we miter folded this and we just have strapping tape every 14 to 16 inches, we are going to get glue squeezing out on the underside here. It is going to be on my workbench. Don't drag the beam across the workbench, otherwise it's going to smear it all over the face. What I do, just lift up the end, give it a 180-degree rotation, pull it down, and then I want to grab my glue chisel. And all I do then, where the glue smeared onto the workbench, I'm just going to quickly clear that off. It shouldn't be very much if you glued it properly. So a couple quick swipes and it's off the workbench, and then I can pull this up here to work on it again. A couple of very important tools in this process are what I call a glue chisel, which is just your typical box store chisel that is semi-dull. A semi-dull chisel works great for going across the miter and just, it pulls the glue right off, and then any little excess piece of that corner that might be hanging over, it'll just take right off. And I find if you do this up and down the miter real quick, both ways, you actually save time because you're not smearing the excess glue on anything. And you're also making the corner perfectly crisp because you're squaring it up. If one corner of the miter happens to be overhanging the other, we're kind of just taking that very small amount of wood off. So it works really well. The other thing that is super nice is a damp rag for cleaning glue off the chisel. I've been out here all day, been using this rag all day, just wiping it on here. Just one of those things, just makes the whole process go easier. So you can see here how much squeeze out I've got on this miter. It's some, but not very much at all. So just getting started cleaning it up. Again, I'll go along and just square this edge taking that glue off. And again, just wiping it occasionally. Works a little bit better with two hands. So this is just a real quick way to prep the miter, to give it a quick sanding, and then it's done. But you'll see how it just takes off that little bit of extra corner that was overhanging there and makes it perfectly crisp. Most of the time, I just scraped the glue off here and this is what it looks like. Most of the time the tape will make the miter come together perfectly and it'll be nice and tight the whole way around. If you do have some boards that are a little bit more wonky, you could end up with an area where the miter doesn't quite pull together tightly. If that happens, you just want to go with your hand, pull it together, and add a few 23 gauge pin nails, and that'll pull it together and you'll be good to go. So you do need to watch out for that. Occasionally you might have to add some pin nails here or there, but generally not very many at all. The next thing we'll do before we set the beam over to dry is just real quickly hit the corner with some 120 grit sandpaper. I like to do this when it's wet because the sawdust mixes with the wet glue and it makes an absolutely seamless miter, and it looks like it grew together. You do have to be careful with this strapping tape. You do not want to sand over the strapping tape because with this sharp edge on this white oak, it'll completely cut the tape and it also makes it harder to pull the tape off later on. So I'm just sanding in between the tape right now, trying very carefully not to hit that tape as I do this. After we've completed our sanding, we can just move the beam over somewhere to dry. I've only got one more beam to do, so I'm just gonna set this one right here. I find that usually after a few hours, you can remove that tape and start finish sanding on these. It sets up pretty quick generally, but obviously you wanna leave them sit as long as you can. One question that might be out there is why don't you just run tape the whole length of the miter like this? And what I've found is that with longer beams like this, where the material is not perfectly straight and not perfectly flat, I get much better results just running the tape perpendicular. It just works better. It allows me to work the pieces in and out as I'm applying the tape, and I wouldn't be able to do that as well if I was applying the tape horizontally all the way across. It would also use a ton more tape on a beam like this. If you're taping the whole seam, the inconsistency, if you fold it, a lot of times it'll make the tape pop off, which means you have to add perpendicular tape on top of your horizontal tape anyways. So there's really a lot of different reasons, but all in all, I've just found doing it this way works much better for longer beam material. One other little trick I didn't do very well the first time is whenever you're laying your board down to fold it, I like to look at where my miter's at and try and make it so that the miter is not going over the top of my dog holes. That way, whenever I go to scrape the glue off, I've got a nice flat surface. If your miter is right on top of your dog holes and the glue squeezes out right on top of the dog holes, it's just a pain. So it's one of those little things to watch out for. So see here, roll it over. My glue is right where I can easily access it. It's all about the little things. In this business, it's all about looking at just those little things that you can do to shave time off. And that's what separates the really successful carpenters from the ones who aren't. There's so many small things that you're doing constantly throughout the day that can be done faster and more efficiently, as opposed to, you can see some guys just seem to do everything the hard way and make it take forever. Okay, so now we've got all our beams glued up. Most of these are all dry and they're ready to go in the van. Now sometimes if I'm in a rush and maybe I build these in the morning, I'll just throw them in the van with the tape on them and remove it at the job site and sand them up at the job site. Right now I've got time, so I'm gonna try and get these tape removed and sanded up. That way we're just ready to go once they're on site. As with everything, even removing the tape, I want to turn into a science and do it as efficiently as possible. So I'll start here on the bottom, take the pieces off that were holding the sides together, and now these pieces here on the ends I can access. These other ones, see, this is what you don't want to have. You don't want to have it to where you're trying to pick it off with your fingernails. That's why I always leave these pieces long and folded over. That way it's easy just to grab them and pull them back. Okay, so after those pieces are pulled off the sides, I'll just give it a flip. We can pull these the rest of the way off. Now, if whenever you were sanding the corners, you sanded your tape, you're gonna have a nightmare trying to get it off because it's gonna break at the corner whenever you try to pull it off. So that's why it's very important that you don't sand over the tape, over that sharp miter. As far as sanding these goes, these will get sanded again on the job site. Whenever I get done scribing them to the ceiling, usually I've got handprints, fingerprints all over them and stuff, and I'll give them a quick sanding right before I do the final install. But at this time, I want to just do a quick go over, basically get them sanded 95% of the way. That way we don't have to do it on site. My weapon of choice is the Festool ETS EC 150 5mm stroke. That 5mm stroke is nice and aggressive, cuts through material really quick. If you've got planer chatter on white oak, it'll still cut through it nicely. And then I use 120 grit sandpaper for everything. It's aggressive enough, it cuts through any glue residue and whatnot, and it's fast enough to get through any snipe marks, scratches, stuff like that, but it still gives you a stain ready finish. 120 grit is adequate for beams that are going on a ceiling, in my opinion. The other very important thing that you must be aware of, whenever you're using tape, it is going to leave tape residue behind. And on a stain grade material like this, we absolutely have to make sure that we are sanding away all of that tape residue, because if a strip of that is left behind and the painter goes and puts stain on it, it's not gonna take the stain the same, and you're gonna see a tape line here, there, or maybe everywhere, and it could be a disaster. So you have to make sure when you're doing this final sanding that you're sanding aggressively enough to get through any tape residue that might be there. After I've finished sanding the surface with the orbital sander, we'll do a quick one over on the corner the whole way, because we haven't sanded everything because the tape was over some parts. So just a quick one over with 120 grit, and now this one's ready to go in the van. Well, that's it. Got the shop all cleared out of beams, loaded up in the back of the van. Power feeder is just incredibly handy. Makes quick work. It's worth it to just have the material here in the shop to be able to make these, because you can just do it so much more precisely and efficiently. And you just, you know, it's so much better than the job site. So 18 beams all loaded up. It's almost 10 o'clock. So I'm gonna drive home, get some sleep, get back on the job site first thing tomorrow. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, appreciate it if you smash that like button, subscribe, and all that good stuff also. Otherwise, we'll see you on the next video.